Ruapehu, one of 3 active volcanoes in the central North Island, that on Christmas Eve 1953 sent a huge lahar of rocks, ice, water and mud down the Whangaehu River, and at the Tangiwai rail bridge, 151 people died. A board of inquiry concluded it was an accident caused by an act of God, but we will see it was predictable, preventable, an accident which should never have happened. Nearly 50 years later, the cycle is repeating, and Ruapehu's crater lake is rising again to the overflow level. In 1953, the power and predictability of this mountain was ignored, and 151 people died needlessly. But are we able to learn from the lessons of the past? Could a Tangiwai disaster happen again? Is there another tragedy waiting in the shadow of this mountain? Here on the Whangaehu River, the scene of that great tragedy, it's deceptively tranquil. But right now, those massive ancient forces are building again, and in the next year or so, Crater Lake will burst. Could there be another Tangiwai disaster? To understand what happened and what can be done about the danger today, we need to go back to Christmas Eve 1953. The powerful pillars of Wellington Station symbolise the importance and safety of travel by the New Zealand Government railways. But on this night, one train, the 3 o'clock express to Auckland, will never reach its destination. And in a tragic series of events, only luck will determine who will live and who will die.
I absolutely love trains, and I was really excited about going up. I had my bag packed well and truly early.
On Christmas Eve, my mother told me to be home for Christmas.
They'd just put this extra carriage on, and there were plenty of unreserved seats, and we moved back into the first class carriage.
Then they called out for you to get on board the train, and I went to step forward and I couldn't. I just stood.
I was going to get the early morning train, but things didn't work out right.
And my auntie growled at me and she says, "For goodness sake, what are you doing? Get on the train." I said, "I can't." She said, "But you love trains." I said, "I just cannot get on the train."
Halfway through its journey tonight, the express will cross a river fed by Ruapehu's crater lake at a remote place which will soon pass into legend and focus the attention of the nation, Tangiwai. 30 hours after the taking of this amateur picture, this rail bridge at Tangiwai will collapse. It was weakened back in 1925 by an avalanche of debris from Ruapehu, which tilted a major pier, and it will not survive the next onslaught from the mountain. Ruapehu, 8 p.m. Christmas Eve 1953. Unseen and unknown to anybody, the outlet beneath the crater lake has just collapsed, releasing millions of tons of rocks, ice and silty water, a lahar down the Whangaehu Glacier. At the same moment, the 3 o'clock express is heading north to Taihape. First of 4 express trains up the trunk to Auckland tonight. It's a busy night for the government railways. Ohakune, 8:15 p.m. Coming in the opposite direction, a freight train has arrived from the north. After shunting, it's scheduled to travel south on the single line, taking the siding at Tangiwai to let the express through. As they go about their duties, the engine crew are unaware they face death down the line. 20 minutes after the cave-in and travelling at 12 miles an hour, the lahar is on a collision course with the freight train at Tangiwai Bridge. 8:30 down at Taihape, fuel and water's taken on as engine KA949 is being made ready to take over the express for the journey over the Volcanic Plateau. On 949 is Lance Redmond, firing for top roster driver Charles Parker with 33 years on the job. Parker and Redmond will take the express up to Pokaka, bringing back a southbound train and expecting to be home early morning for Christmas with their families. The packed express arrives at Taihape. With nearly every seat taken, passengers scrambled for the refreshment rooms, while Parker and Redmond backed their locomotive onto the train. On Ruapehu, the lahars nearly down onto the plateau. 9 o'clock, on time.
So Charlie and Lance were a great combination on the engine. By the time we coupled up the engine and the brakes were done, the guard was blowing his whistle for right away, and they started to chug out, singing out Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, that sort of type of thing, being Christmas Eve. And that was the last time I saw them.
The Express's departure is a ritual many people in Taihape set their watches by. On this typical night in the early 50s, the steam railways a powerful, regular rhythm of life, when the other way of getting around is in a 10-horsepower car. After some Christmas shopping in Taihape in one such car, 2 men are ready to drive home up to Oakune.
Well, we were in Taihape doing the Christmas shopping, and we left to come home about the same time as the train, the express left Taihape.
When we left Taihape, we hadn't got very far down the road, and out across the paddocks we could see the express going along. We could see the lights of the carriages, and someone, because it was always an important means of transport in those days, and we were always aware of where the express was.
With 11 heavy cars on the drawbar, the long train will take an hour to climb up onto the volcanic plateau. 9:35, Karioi Station, north up the line from Tangiwai. The southbound freight train stops to shunt some wagons. Now, a tragic decision is made. The freight train's running late, so rather than delay the express, the freight is held at Karioi. Nobody can imagine the terrible consequences of this simple decision. Instead of a slow freight, it means the next train over Tangiwai Bridge, moments after it's been hit by the lahar, will be the speeding express, a train crowded with people. 9:45. The express is nearing Waihuru. On just this night, when running late would avert disaster, it's still on time. For the past 2 hours, locals at Waihuru have been puzzled by rumbling noises on Ruapehu. Events are now moving rapidly. In a chance of millions to one, the ancient cycles of the mountain and the time-honored passing of the train become locked together. 10:06. If only somebody, anybody, would listen to the mountain, understand the mountain. The seconds pass. There's still a chance to hold the express at Waihuru, investigate the noise, but nothing is done to stop the train. Time narrows. Ten minutes to Tangiwai. As events rapidly close in around him, the unwitting station agent at Tangiwai is now the key figure in this deadly sequence. In his small signal box, the agent, Raymond Hall, prepares to clear the express onto Karioi and over Tangiwai Bridge just past his station. The lives of 285 people are now in Hall's hands. He is the only man who can now avert the tragedy. But despite the huge noise of the approaching lahar, Hall does not attempt to halt the train. Even now, a ring to his cabin and Hall could act. 10:15, the lahar strikes the bridge. No one calls. Racing down its final mile through Tangiwai Station, the train's now beyond all help. Over 500 tons of headlong force. Seconds before 10:21,
I peered through the window to see the mountain, and then I turned round and had just starting to sit down when the train started to sway. I thought, as I sat in the seat, that it was going to, if it went much further, we'd be over.
What happens in the final moments on this night will always remain a blur in history, firing myths and legends. Like the story of the lone man out in the dark, desperately trying to stop the train. That man was to become a folk hero, but the story of his actions that night, conveniently we suggest, overshadowed the other players in this tragedy. We are going to examine what really happened on that fateful night.
That's when I picked up the phone, control phone, and I heard a voice say, "The express is in the river." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "In the Tangiwai River, the train's gone in." He said, "Where are the passengers?" And I heard the voice say, "They're floating down to Whangaehu."
Two ladies waving frantically in the middle of the road to pull us up. And as Jim said, he sort of skirted around them a little bit. And she come running over. Jim wound the window down and she said, "Oh, there's been a terrible, terrible accident." She said, "The river's in flood," she said, "and the train, the express, has just gone into the river."
We were wondering at the time as to why the express wasn't in. It must be late.
They told us that 66, which was express, had gone into the river at Tangiwai, and that Charlie Parker was dead.
Christmas Day, 1953. Amid the terrible carnage, 151 people have died.
I said, "God save me." All the lights went out. There was just like inside a concrete mixer. People were screaming and the terrific bang. We must have hit the bed of the river. The brakes were applied to throw me off the seat on the floor. The brakes were applied on rigorously.
We were lifting out bodies. Most people didn't have any clothes because the friction of the torrent had ripped all their clothing off. Most people. And they were going around in blankets that they'd got from the army.
The trees, the banks around the river were festooned with debris from the crash, clothing, that sort of thing.
Helping to pull a big old man out. He was, when I say old, he was absolutely stuffed up. His whole suit with soot. It was silt. And that silt was a terrible thing. It must have killed a lot of people that were getting into their lungs. It's still coming down, rolling down boulders. And the smell of sulphur and it was very strong.
I was on the top of the carriage. I took quite a few people to pull. Somebody pushed them up, and I was pulling them out.
And I looked out the window and saw, I couldn't believe what I saw, actually, a lighted carriage on its side, floating down its side with the lights on and the river, and then it suddenly went out.
Suddenly, darkness. Everyone screaming, "What happened? My God." Huh.
Graham Stewart was a young photographer for the Herald newspaper who drove through the night from Auckland, arriving at Tangiwai on Christmas afternoon.
We covered the wreckage. I talked about survivors I met who were still wandering in a daze around the scene. Some of the carriages, one of them I actually, you might say, crawled inside to photograph the scene of the twisted seats and the luggage racks and that. And on the floor and on the luggage racks, of course, there were children's dolls and other toys, which brought it all home to you, how suddenly their lives had come to a close. After a while, a taxi came back and we managed to hitch a ride down to Taihape, where we interviewed and photographed Cyril Ellis.
The story of the lone man trying to save the Express has become part of the legend of the Tangiwai disaster, and the name of Cyril Ellis dominated the events of Christmas Eve. Driving north that night, Ellis couldn't get over the road bridge, which had been destroyed by the lahar. The story goes he saw the light of the approaching express and ran to the tracks into the path of the train, but despite the warning, the driver didn't see him. But timing casts doubt on the Ellis legend. From the railway crossing where he first saw the train to Tangiwai Bridge is only a kilometre. Just a minute's travel for an express train. Only a minute to perform an astonishing human feat. For Ellis had just a minute to run 80 yards, scale 2 fences, climb an embankment in the dark, then dash down the tracks into the path of the speeding express. It was impossible for Ellis to have reached the tracks in time, as the legend has it, to try to warn the driver. But it seems most likely that he reached the line after the braking engine and front carriages had gone past and into the river. What we do know is that he climbed aboard Car Z that had stopped briefly before it too toppled into the river. Along with a passenger, John Holman, and the guard, Bill Ingalls, we also know that Ellis helped save many lives.
A lot of people doubt that Cyril Ellis did what he was claimed to have done, but he went across there. He tried to stop that train.
It was, I think, generally discounted that this man had done what he said he had done.
He finished up in the carriage, went down with it. He played a huge part in getting them all out of it. I'm pretty sure he was the last one out of the carriage.
But he certainly told us to get out, but we didn't have any chance to get out, and he didn't even have any chance to get off. So he went down with the carriage.
He came over to the fire that we got lit. He was stripped to the waist, and he was hyped up, and but he was the intrepid hero that night, in my opinion.
But to understand what really happened at Tangiwai, it's necessary to remove Ellis from the limelight. In fact, evidence shows driver Parker hit the brakes 700 feet before the bridge, but not because of Ellis. Evelyn Munster, safe near the back of the train, gives us a vital clue as to why the driver applied the brakes and in so doing saved the lives of 134 passengers.
And that's the way I described it, as being on a peninsula around there with water on either side.
Analysing the information and talking to survivors, we can now create a picture of what the driver saw. Finally, we understand why Parker braked the train. Not because of Ellis. Ellis wasn't there. Ellis couldn't have been there. That was impossible. Parker saw the lahar, not ahead, but beside him, as if driving on a peninsula. But live heroes are a useful diversion, it seems, and the truth of that night somehow eluded the Board of Inquiry. It now seems so obvious. Because of his quick reactions and because he wasn't speeding, driver Charlie Parker was able to save the last half of his train. An examination of the controls showed the crew cut the oil supply and sanded the tracks to help the braked wheels grip the tracks in a desperate attempt to stop the train. Charles Parker, the real hero of Tangiwai, finally emerges.
The brake pedestal here had sort of jammed up against in here. The oil lever had been shut off.
Yeah, we actually saw sanding on the lines, you know, where someone had applied sand to the rails.
I know that he wouldn't dare go over the speed limit or do anything like that.
He'd have probably been going along there at around about 50 mile an hour. Other drivers there would have been doing 60, 70 mile an hour.
My father, being so cautious, probably the people in the first class carriages and even some in the second class would have owed their lives to what he did on that particular night. and probably didn't receive the recognition that he probably should have.
Yet all the frantic efforts of the heroic driver had been futile. Tangiwai was already a weakened bridge from 1925, badly positioned, a disaster waiting to happen, and totally unable to withstand another large assault from Ruapehu, a bridge which would be at the centre of a cover-up at the inquiry into the disaster. The Board of Inquiry into the Tangiwai disaster sat in March 1954, 2 months after the tragedy. Lineup of council was high-powered, including a future Governor-General. And as with all bureaucratic procedures of the era, engaged an army of secretaries and typists. In the 6 weeks that it sat, the board interviewed and cross-examined 58 witnesses, examined 74 exhibits, and the half-ton of paperwork went to produce a report totaling nearly 1,400 pages. Because of its small population at the time, virtually everybody in New Zealand was affected by the Tangiwai disaster and either knew of or were related to a passenger on doomed Express 626. So reports of the day-to-day news of the Board of Inquiry were followed with interest.
The civil engineers were the principal rail witnesses at the inquiry. It was a suggestion that the bridge had not been soundly constructed, that the piers had not been properly founded because of expedients said to have been introduced by F.W. Firkett, who was in charge of the completion of that section of the main trunk railway.
The construction of the main trunk line across the volcanic plateau with its high viaducts was a wonder of the pioneering age, although engineers didn't seem to be concerned that for 40 miles the railway ran close to 2 active volcanoes. An expert of his time, William Rankin, advised that where floods could be expected, the land should be crossed by viaducts and warned against earth embankments. But he was ignored. This section of line at Tangiwai broke all the rules, and incredibly Transrail still uses the same route today. When a big lahar hits, this embankment acts as a dam, trapping water and debris, and to make matters worse, the bridge crosses the river on a sharp bend at the far end of the floodplain. Tangiwai Bridge was, and still is, a sitting target for the next lahar. In 1925, a lahar came down the Whangaehu, moving pier number 4 half an inch off centre. This photo of Tangiwai Bridge, unknown to the inquiry of the day, was taken a few months before the disaster and reveals only makeshift repairs to Pier 4. For years, engine crews reported a slight sideways kick as they passed over the bridge. From that day on, the Tangiwai disaster was waiting to happen because Pier number 4 had been scoured or washed out under its base.
Let's have a look at our selection of Tangiwai colours. It's all kept.
Phil Holmes is a respected civil engineer with a wide knowledge of bridges.
I think it's very likely that the scour was a major influence at this pier. We had large volume of water coming down the river at high velocity. Water forces would have bowled the pier over when there was no longer any support from the ground. It would have possibly broken off at a construction joint and then been simply bowled over downstream.
We can now demonstrate for the first time what probably happened at Tangiwai. Scoured and sitting like a loose tooth in the riverbed, Pier 4 is the only pier to be taken out by the lahar. The railways would argue the bridge failed against an overwhelming onslaught, but that was not true. The 1953 lahar was not big enough to take out the whole bridge, despite its faults. Apart from scoured Pier 4, which was flung 40 yards downstream, the rest of it held, only collapsing like a pack of cards under the weight of the train. For railways engineers, the scouring of Pier 4 was a subject to be played down. Had it held, the express might have got across and there would have been no Tangiwai disaster. At the Board of Inquiry, New Zealand railway engineers remained intransigent against cross-examination over the failure of Bridge 136 at Tangiwai. The heat was turned on them over the crucial question, was the accident foreseeable? And if pier number 4 had been scoured and not sufficiently firmly embedded, then there could be a finding of negligence and compensation. Their replies to key questions were evasive. Could the railways have taken more notice of warnings? The 1925 lahar? A 9-foot rise in the river and no rain? No, you say we received warnings. I don't know that we did. Were not the bridge foundations totally inadequate? Well, I do not agree with you. In this age, before television news, newspaper headlines reporting the inquiry began to cast a shadow beyond reasonable doubt. The railway's case was, however, straightforward. The Tangiwai disaster had been an act of God and unforeseeable. They did not seem to take the body of evidence seriously and dug their toes in. At the inquiry, independent engineers were critical of the railways. One engineer expressed a common view. The weight of evidence presented indicates that scour caused the failure of the railway bridge. Scour has been known and recognized by engineers as a problem for a long time. And it's striking that during the inquiry, there's been no real and original discussion of the problem by the department's engineers. But all the damning evidence showing there was a case of negligence against the railway engineers going back to 1925, when the damage was first done to Pier 4, was to be ignored by the Board of Inquiry. And there was to be even more compelling evidence that would be ignored about the mountain.
See the first glimmer of dawn coming up. As Omar Khayyam would have said, dawn's left hand in the sky. And looking up at the mountain, and someone said, that's the cause of the trouble. And it looked so silent and so innocent, almost standing there, that it just seemed unbelievable.
In fact, the lahar that swept away the express had been 7 years in the making. Ruapehu's spectacular eruptions during 1945 were a telling reminder to all New Zealanders of the awesome nature of the volcanoes of the central North Island. They also led to a sequence of events that directly contributed to the Tangiwai disaster. Following the eruptions, the crater began to fill with water, eventually rising above its rim to burst with twice the force of the lahar that damaged Tangiwai Bridge in 1925. In their heyday, the railways were heavily promoted, and trains were all the trend during the 1920s and 30s. And as if in defiance of the mountains, the main trunk railway opened access to the volcanic plateau for leisure and sport. From National Park Station, it was only half an hour by service car to the chateau. For years, all the trains bringing these people to play in their beautiful but dangerous fairyland had been crossing rivers and gullies with a known danger from lahars. The Whangaehu River at Tangiwai was, and to this day, is not the only place a disaster could strike. Lahars could come down rivers from Ruapehu, striking viaducts at Mangaturuturu and Makatote. The dangers of the Whangaehu had already featured in Willis's guidebook and the government yearbook of 1899. The water from this crater flows by underground channels into the Whangaehu River, in 1859 causing an enormous amount of water, ice and debris to tear down the mountainside.
The smell of sulphur was almost overpowering. As an aside, I've known the river well because I was brought up in the district, and as kids we never knew it had the name of Whangaehu River. To us it was the sulphur stream, because the banks always had a coating of yellow sulphur on it, and you could smell the sulphur any time you went near it.
Any doubt about the lethal combination of the Whangaehu River and Ruapehu was dispelled in every local cinema, the place where most people in this era went for information and entertainment. The warning came from the highest source.
Here it goes. We have an eruption. Not a very serious one, perhaps, but a very interesting one all the same.
Professor Cotton was in New Zealand during Ruapehu's 1945 eruptions, and this film played in cinemas all around the country.
Well, lava may fill the crater, overflow, run down the side of the mountain, in which case one might expect a flood of water carrying with it boulders and volcanic ash to rush down onto the surrounding country.
But warnings are not always heeded. Eric Fetzer was a mountain guide. He alerted authorities to a collapse in the ice cave on Ruapehu, and they laughed at him. When it burst soon after, the 1925 lahar damaged the rail bridge, triggering events that led to the Tangiwai disaster. The next warnings came 25 years later from two young mountaineers. One young engineer with an interest in the crater lake was Louis Vors.
We met up with the Mead brothers, the pioneers of the mountain, and they let me know that they had a concern about the lahars in the past, and that there would be more, possibly some bridges that get washed out, some farm cattle killed.
His friend was a law student with an interest in canoeing unsurveyed rivers, Jim Mason.
Well, we were aware of Lewis's concerns and the Mead brothers' concerns and the rate that the lake was rising. And when a mountaintop lake keeps rising at half an inch a day, one assumes someone should be concerned about it.
Starting as a bit of fun to measure the depth of the lake, their recreation was to soon become a serious mission. In 1950, just 3 years before the Tangiwai disaster, the young men returned to the crater lake several times, and worried by its steady rise, began a systematic sounding of the lake, taking an 8mm movie camera along to record their progress. Their findings caused them to become alarmed.
The hot water of the lake had risen above its normal level, and just a metre or two above that level there was a vast mud-flat area larger than a football field with about 60 metres of ice on it, a glacier actually flowing into the lake. So that as soon as the hot water level rose a metre or two above its normal level, it started to cut back under this glacier. And the glacier was cascading, melting, cascading into the lake, sending huge waves right across the lake and echoing back again. When we took those photos, it was just a metre or two above the normal level. From then on, the lake was running on borrowed time. It was above the hard rock sill of the crater, held back only by an ash wall.
So we were quite aware at the rate the water was rising. We relayed this to the scientists. They knew the contour of the bottom of the lake, because that's what we were up there with the boats to do, and they knew a lot of facts.
Now convinced that they were onto something important, in 1951 Louis Vors wrote to the Department of Geological Survey.
And as I cannot find any sign of the big ice cave outlet of the pre-eruption days, I'm wondering just what will happen in 2 or 3 years' time.
But the young men would become bitterly disappointed. Despite their compelling evidence, there was no response.
Nobody took any real interest in it. We saw the danger. There'd been articles in the Whangaehu Herald that Lewis had written. I feel that we could have been more forceful and created a greater interest in the safety of the mountain at that time. And this is what I don't want to recur.
The inquiry came out that it was an act of God and no one to blame. I knew jolly well that someone knew about it, it was avoidable, and someone must have been to blame.
From Christmas Day 1953, the Tangiwai disaster had been a talking point around the nation. 6 months later, in May 1954, the inquiry released its answer to a key question: whether at any time anybody in the New Zealand government failed to exercise reasonable care or duty in relation to circumstances leading to the accident. The answer? No blame. To independent experts who gave evidence, this was a bombshell decision. Quite apart from the state of the bridge itself, 151 people had died needlessly because of the ignored geological warnings as recent as 1951. But there was more. As we've discovered, other important evidence was given no weight in the findings of the Board of Inquiry. Tangiwai was the worst railway accident in New Zealand's history. It was among the 8 deadliest rail smashes in the world. An act of God or negligence? The Board of Inquiry found an act of God the only cause, yet the independent evidence at Tangiwai pointed to negligence. An already weakened bridge spanned a lahar path, over corners, with an embanked approach forcing the water back. A pier was sitting loose in the riverbed, having never been embedded into the rock after similar events in 1925 and 1946. Warnings about the rising lake in 1925 and 1951 ignored. Stories of previous sudden floods from many sources, including historic records and publications, ignored. No act of God. There was enough information to make this accident predictable. So was there a cover-up? There are opposing views.
It became clear that the whole cause was a natural disaster that nobody could anticipate.
It wasn't an act of God at all. It was an act of negligence, and somebody was to blame.
Not according to the railways, but Louis Vos was determined not to give up.
And these are the reasons why I started to dig my toes in to find out what was going on in this inquiry. Was it a cover-up?
I couldn't see anywhere in the evidence that I heard where blame could be apportioned to any one particular individual or any group of individuals.
But the evidence was all there. Jim Healy of Geological Survey produced a copy of Louis Vos's warning letter of 1951, tabled at the inquiry as Exhibit 28, where it lay unread. Why weren't the young men called to be cross-examined? Why wasn't their evidence made public? Believing the Tangiwai disaster occurred because they'd already been ignored, the young canoeists became even more suspicious. Was evidence deliberately held back to avoid a finding of negligence and costly compensation for the government?
Well, what concerned me was that the 3 documents were there, but the 4th one, where I discussed the possible solutions to opening up the cavity, that was missing. The fact was that the inquiry was entitled to know there was a way of opening up that excavation and avoiding the 151 people being killed.
And the public was entitled to know that their deaths were avoidable. But authorities were happy to have a hero. So was Cyril Ellis used to create a smokescreen to divert attention from the real issues?
Well, I think the political system and the political style was very different from 50 years later. I think one thing that really stands out is that it was a much less open political system. We didn't have an Official Information Act, we had an Official Secrets Act. We didn't have an ombudsman. We didn't have select committees that investigated what was going on in the public sector.
Instead, the inadequate findings of the inquiry meant little was ever done to protect public safety around the volcanic plateau. Until 1995. The mountain's spectacular eruptions of 1995, 50 years after the 1945 eruptions, renewed memories of the Tangiwai disaster and rocketed concerns of the danger into the 21st century. The ancient cycles of the mountain are repeating, and even without another eruption, the crater lake will burst again soon. Could a Tangiwai disaster happen again? Blasting, trenching and channeling the crater rim to remove the danger are amongst 25 different options that have already been considered in a government-commissioned report. But local Māori, DOC and many others firmly oppose any intrusion on the natural landscape.
Ruapehu, our ancestral mountain, and Te Waiamoi, the crater lake, are sacred to the Ngāti people. Ruapehu is a living, breathing force that provides us with spiritual sustenance. It is a gift to be kept sacred by all people, a gift to be honoured and respected not only by Ngāti but all people of our nation. The timeless face of our ancestral mountain must not be changed by the hand of man. If we allow this to happen, then there is no place left sacred in the world, and all that we value is lost forever.
Harry Keyes, a scientist with the Department of Conservation, supports that view.
This is a national park that's set aside, the World Heritage is set aside for natural processes. Lahars, eruptions are natural processes. There's been hundreds of lahars in the last few hundred years down here. Just in the 95-96 eruption alone, there were over 30 lahars. Lahars have formed this landscape. They've formed the big, huge plains, we call them ring plains, around the volcanoes. That's caused by lahars over the hundreds of thousands of years.
DOC scientists are constantly monitoring the crater lake.
At the moment, the lake is still 25 metres below the old overflow point, and so it poses no danger at the moment. There's no threat at the moment. But when the lake rises up, if it rises past that overflow because the sand and ash is in the way, then the question is how high will it rise against that ash, and when will it fail?
Alarm systems have been selected as the most effective, economic and ecologically sound way to minimise danger from the crater lake. Up on the Whangaehu Glacier, an alarm system incorporating 3 acoustic sensors and 1 water level sensor is planned to be in place before the crater lake is due to reach a dangerous level. Construction of a barrier to protect the desert road and Tangiwai River has already been finished.
There were no alarm systems in 1953. There'll be 2 alarm systems. There's the new system that we're putting in that will be very reliable. And there's the Transrail alarm system, which is focused on the railway operation. So there are 2 alarm systems and responses to them that will prevent loss of life.
Transrail has its own alarm system upriver of the Tangiwai Bridge. And though a huge lahar could still take out the bridge, the warning system should prevent loss of life. The scandal and tragedy of Christmas Eve 1953 is that warnings of a natural recurring event were ignored. Following a path carved for itself over thousands of years, an overflow lahar wiped out a damaged pier on the wrongly positioned bridge, moments before a crowded express train came upon it. This was an avoidable accident. Had the young men, Vors and Mason, been heard? Had the bridge been properly repaired? Had the railway been positioned with safety in mind? There would have been no loss of life on Christmas Eve 1953. The failure of the Board of Inquiry to find fault resulted in very little being done to protect the public for 45 years. So that 151 people did not die in vain, all these years later we need to learn from the tragedy. However, New Zealanders still literally play with fire on a daily basis as we live and play on 3 active volcanoes. 3 popular ski fields are on Ruapehu slopes, and 2 main highways and the main trunk line run close to Ruapehu, Narahoi and Tongariro. It's only a matter of time before the crater lake overflows again. Ruapehu could erupt without warning, wreaking havoc in all directions. And there's still concern about the railway line at Tangiwai. A new bridge was built in the same place with an embanked approach, not viaducts, crossing the lahar path over corners. The same route that a century ago violated all safe engineering practices. 100 years ago, the wrong place to build a railway, and today, the wrong place to have a railway bridge. Tangiwai will remain a place where memories will always linger of a night when 151 people needlessly died in an accident which should never have happened.
There always is a sadness. Christmas Eve never comes without remembrance.
Christmas Eve does have a twang of sorrow with it, even when you've got others around you.
I always think of the Tangiwai disaster. It always passes through my mind from time to time. I don't think it's a thing that you'd ever forget. You know, knowing that you could have been on that and you might not be here.
33 hours since the train accident at Tangiwai till our arrival in Auckland. And we were the lucky ones who were able to finish our trip.